Yes, good morning, students. Let us resume our discussion on the poetry of Ramanujan. I was telling you about the book, An Illustrated History of Indian Writing in Indian Literature in English, edited by A.K. Mehrotra, who's also a well-known Indian English poet, and in which you have this interesting chapters on various writers who are prescribed in your syllabus. We have this chapter on A.K. Ramanujan. Looking for A.K. Ramanujan is the title of that chapter. What is that a reference to? Why do you think each of the titles is, interestingly worded? Many of the chapters, in fact, you have interesting titles, but for this one, we'll focus on this one now. Looking for A.K. Ramanujan is what they have used, what he has used as the title of that chapter. I want you to tell me what that is a reference to. Looking for A.K. Ramanujan. Why has that specific title been chosen? Anyone? It is a play upon the title of one of his best-known poems, which we discussed the other day. Looking for a cousin on a country swing, on a swing. Don't you remember that poem? Looking for it. It's a reference to that. Most of the chapters are titled with that kind of playful use of words related to the works of the writers. So, this photograph that I was talking about, the one which was used as the cover page of one of his books, Relations is the title of that book of anthology of poems. And this is what the editor chose as the cover picture. You have the poet Ramanujan and his face superimposed with the image of his parents. He was initially aghast when he saw this. It was not his decision. It was the decision of the editor to use this kind of a picture. And he first shocked, but then later he said, yeah, let us retain this because it would be better than seeing my face entirely on the cover. But be that as it may, this is a cover that I think very well suggests the poetry that is Ramanujan's. The poetry that is so rooted in his background, his family, in his memories, in his childhood, in his upbringing, his tradition, and his religion. At the same time, not getting so overtly emotionally attached to any of this so as to glorify it. You do not have that kind of sentimental attachment or glorification at all. On the other hand, you have a kind of distancing, a very ironic distancing, I would call it. Irony is one of the chief features of Ramanujan's poetry. It is something that adds so much of maturity and finesse to his poetry. It is a figure of speech that he constantly uses in order to maintain that distance between himself and the things that he writes about. All the topics, all the themes, all the things that he writes about, of course, belong to his background. And it is, in a sense, in the way that he talks about them, you realize that he is accepting their significant presence in his life, underlining the fact that his makeup is made up of all these, and that what he is a result of all these things in his background. At the same time, never getting nostalgically attached or sentimentally glorifying them. This, I think, is a feature that you find in all of Ramanujan's poems. It was a long a span actually of a poetic career. He began quite early, and until his very last years in the 1990s, he actually continued to write poetry. But during these 40-odd years of his poetic career, never once did he write about things that he saw, observed, and experienced during his stint abroad. He lived a good deal, or a good part of his life in the United States, but you do not have him describing the American landscape or the American culture. It is always back to India that he comes in search of the themes for his poems. And it was a life that was so actively involved with academic engagements with Indian literary works, both of the classical and of the folk variety. So that is again another feature of Ramanujan's poetry. There's something very, apart from that Indianness, you cannot consider it as highbrow, even though there is a very powerful influence of the classics, the Tamil and Kannada classics that he so passionately engaged with, and which many of which he translated to English. At the same time, you find a very keen interest in the folk tales, the folk narratives, the folklore of his Indian background. So, for having introduced both the high and the low, the so-called high and the low, the elitist, Brahminical, classical culture, and the very ordinary, grounded folk culture of India. So he can be considered as a very significant scholar who introduced that kind of comprehensive image of India to the West, for which, he is often acknowledged by Western academics and scholars. I would also like to, so this is a chapter that you would benefit from reading, very interestingly narrated. Also, another book that I would firmly recommend is this one, Three Indian Poets, written by Bruce King. This is again taken from our library. We have 2 copies of this book, Three Indian Poets, by Bruce King, Bruceking. You have a discussion on the works of Nisimesikil, Domare, and A.K. Ramanujan. I think all 3 poets are prescribed for your study. So this is a book that would give you very valuable information, not just on these three poets, but there are some very insightful comments on Indian writing in English in general, the evolution, the growth of Indian writing in English. What I was trying to impress upon you in the previous class about the maturity that you can encounter in the later years of Indian writing in English, moving from a point of time when they were always conscious about writing in a foreigner's language, writing in the colonial master's language and so on, and writing with the agenda of aiding the freedom movement and communicating to a pan-Indian audience and so on. From that point, you move to a more mature, a very freer, fuller kind of expression, where you do not feel encumbered by any agenda, where you do not feel very conscious about using someone else's language. It is a language that they dream in, as Kamala Das rightly says, and that free flow of ideas, thoughts, expressions, images, and metaphors. They do not feel conscious about the fact that they are writing about Indian themes using a foreign language. That divide is no longer there, and you can find the beginnings of that kind of free and mature expression in the poems of mainly these three writers, Nisimesikil, Domare, and A.K. Ramanujan. Of course, Kamala Das is also a poet who should rightly be included in this list. And it is from these poets that you now reach the full flow of later Indian poets like Jetail, Arundhati Subramanian, and all the later Indian writers in English. So these four poets, Nisimesikil, Domare, A.K. Ramanujan, and Kamala Das, paved the way for later writers like Arun Kolatkar, Jeev Patel. Who else? Apart from the two that I earlier mentioned, you can also think of Jayanta Mahapatra. Okay, they're all mature Indian poets. So in this, you have an introductory chapter plus 3 very exhaustive chapters on the 3 poets. In the introductory chapter, I'll just read out certain lines about Ramanujan. Just a second. Yeah. So this is on page 10, an introduction to A.K. Ramanujan's poetry. It is easy, when you read his poems, it is easy to read. He was Indian. A.K. Ramanujan, who was raised in a family that was both modern and traditional South Indian Brahmin, carried memories of an older India to America, where he lived for many years. While being very much part of the world of modern ideas, international travel, and rapid cultural changes, Ramanujan was also concerned with his Indianness, not in a revivalistic manner. It's not as if he wants to revive that Arsha Bharata Samskarama. That kind of glorification is not what you find in his poems. Not in a revivalistic manner, but as a past from which he grew, a past which remained part of himself. He very consciously accepts the fact that he is part of that tradition. There is no escaping that. He did not sentimentalize his Indianness and at times seemed to regard it as a plague. The irony reaches a point where at times he feels, we feel that he seems to suggest that, it was a kind of curse that he was burdened to carry. But at the same time, he does not criticize it and say all kinds of negative things about it either. So it is not too much of praise, not too much of criticism, but a very objective acceptance of that background. It was there whether he wanted it or not. If his consciousness of being part of an Indian heritage is different from that of Ezekiel or Moray, he was, of the three, the most influenced by and most a part of modernist poetry. A person who, as a professor of linguistics in the University of Chicago, actually had much to do with, more than the other poets. He was very much influenced by the modernist poets like Yeats, Eliot, and Ezra Pound. And, so the influence of their works on his poems is also something that you can find, especially in some of the forms and the images, the treatment of the images, the way he uses the fragment of images as you have it in Eliot's poetry. He is at the other extreme from Moray's romanticism, use of older literary conventions, ease in British tonalities, and lack of interest in Indianness. Lack of interest in the sense of lack of passionate involvement. It is very much there, but you do not have that sentimental attachment. So he was very much a modern poet, instinctively ironic, and had a mind packed with a wide variety of ideas and information. An intellectual at home with the latest concepts and theories, he was also concerned with Indian philosophy and literature, with family relationships in India, and with himself as someone molded by a wide variety of influences. His Indianness is a part of his past, the seed from which he grew and to which he remained inextricably linked as he changed and developed. So that is there in his makeup. So you have a lot of childhood memories. And one other interesting facet of the use of these memories, the use of these past experiences, is the very interesting and dynamic relationship that is maintained in his poems between the past and the present. We always say the past influences the present. Isn't that so? T.S. Eliot, for example, in an essay like Tradition and Individual Talent, talks about the way the grand tradition, the great tradition, shapes the present. It is always there. We are very conscious and aware of the very powerful influence that the past can have on the present. And in the way that he writes about his Indianness, about his religion, about his past, his childhood, and his early memories, you find that the past is constantly present in the present. At the same time, in Ramanujan, you also find, a step ahead, he moves a step ahead, and the present also influences the past. In other words, your experiences, your learning, your exposure to a lot of new things, all of these, in a way, help you to redefine the past. So the past does not remain there as a very powerful monolith, a big stone which casts its shadow on the present. The present also shapes the past. That is what you have in a poem like Looking for a Cousin on a Swing, where you have a childhood memory being recalled by the speaker, right? What was a childhood memory of playing with a cousin on a swing? Isn't that so? But as an adult, the second part of the poem, which is an experienced person's words. In the first part, you have innocence. In the second part, you have experience. And this experienced person is a person who has traveled much, lived in many different cities, seen a great deal, experienced much more, as a result of which, looking back on that childhood experience, she realizes that it was something more than a mere childhood game of playing on the swing. Even that takes on a different interpretation or meaning. It begins to get sexual overtones. If you remember, there is a reference to the fig and the scarlet figs and so on. All of these give it a sexual coloring. It is her experience as an adult, as a person who has traveled much and been exposed to much, which enables her to see that early experience in a different light. There is another poem of his called Ancestors. In the poem Ancestors, he talks about ancestors are in my bone. He compares it to the kind of crocodiles in a body of water, in a river. You might not think that they are there. The water looks still, but you go deeper and you realize that the crocodiles are very much there in the water. And this is the way his ancestors live in his bones. Again, look at the kind of irreverence with which he talks about, the ironic irreverence. He does not say, oh, I am what I am because of my ancestors and I'm thankful to them for the glorious tradition that they have passed on. That kind of treatment is not there at all in him. I would specifically like to talk about a poem of his in which you have a childhood. As a child, he recalls a particular memory of, on the occasion of the death of an elderly woman in the family, probably his grandmother or so. What he recalls, is in his mind is deeply imprinted. The image of that grandmother's daughter, probably his aunt or someone, lifting the pillow that was used by the grandmother before her death. So this was an image that he had. Of course, he did not have any idea at all as to what that meant. But this image was always there. And it was later, much later, as an adult, who began to travel and who began to look back at his life with his learning and with his experience and so on, and who probably also got to know these relatives better. He realizes as an adult, when he looks back, that action was actually not the gesture of mourning as we would normally think it to be. In fact, the aunt was actually looking for the bangles, the gold bangles that might have been left by the grandmother before her death, and it would in all probability be under the pillow that she would have hidden it. So as an adult, he realizes that when somebody in your family passes away, it is not always sorrow and only that you have other mercenary and interest also. So this is the way in which the early experiences are shaped by the present. So this the dynamic relationship between the past and the present is another important feature of Ramanujan's poetry. I think the poem River is probably one that you will study, which again invites our attention to another aspect of Ramanujan's poetry. He's not a person who feels cowed down by convention. He flouts conventions to a certain extent. And this idea is brought home in a very powerful manner in the poem River, where you have, I think I left the textbook in the classroom, in the department. Okay, the river is about the river Vaigai that flows through the city of Madurai. Madurai, of course, is the seat of Tamil culture, and he talks about the river Vaigai, which flows through the river Madurai. The poets of old sang about the river Vaigai. They had much to sing about it. They lived during a period of time when, the river was in full flow, physically and also metaphorically. The river symbolized for them the rich tradition of Tamil culture, and all the glory and the richness of Tamil was celebrated by the old poets. But now the times have changed, but the new poets continue to sing about the river Vaigai as or following the masters. They feel that if it is poetry, we should write in this manner. That is the same? Okay, yeah. Yeah, and you can compare the two, Parthasarathi and Ramanujan, the way in which the two of them are alike and also different in their own unique ways. So here they continue to sing about the past, even though the river has actually dried down to a trickle. When you look at the river now, he says, things have changed. You have witnessed a great deal of environmental changes, as a result of which the river is now a mere trickle. It has dried up to such an extent that it exposes the very dirty things. You have the rusted iron bars of the concrete structures. There is a bridge that is built on it, and you can see the rusted iron bars. You can see all kinds of dirty things, hair and all that sticking to the bars and all that. This is the reality. But poets, believing that poetry is something else and that it is not connected with reality, continue to sing in the manner of the old poets. They are weighed down by the weight of convention, of poetic convention, as a result of which the poetry has no meaning at all. You have Ramanujan introducing some images of what really happens during the to the river. On the one hand, in summer, it dries down to a trickle. In the rainy season, it overflows. But it overflows not signifying any gratefulness or what shall you say, glory, but it wreaks havoc actually. There is so much flooding there. You have so many things being swept away. You have an animal, you have a woman, a pregnant woman, and so on, and a cow, Gopi and Brinda. These are the names of the two animals that have been, the cattle that have been washed away. Then the mother with pregnant twins and so on. People talk about this. They are very, very clear about what the damage that has been done by, that has been caused by the flood, but none of that gets reflected in their poetry. When they talk very specifically about the numbers, the losses, and so on. But in poetry, you do not find any of those. So that is about Ramanujan's poetry. Let us now, I read out Ramanujan's poem, Mother of Mothers, among other things to you. Another interesting poem of his is Small-Scale Reflections on a Large House, on an ancestral house. Small-Scale Reflections on a, I'll just give you the title. That again is typical Ramanujan, Small-Scale Reflections. Yeah, Small-Scale Reflections on a Great House. It is supposed to, on a great house. It is supposed to have been inspired by, some of the great houses about which the poet W.B. Yeats has written. Yeats was very closely connected with the Irish Renaissance, the Irish literary revival, and so on. We remember the poem Easter 1916. Have you studied that poem? Yeah, in which he talks about some of the eminent people who were involved in the struggle. And the eminent families of Ireland, the rich aristocratic families, were very much involved. You remember the names of Countess Maciwis and so on, whom he numbers. He says, I number them too in my poem. Yeah, he talks about them. In other words, and he writes a poem about the ancestral houses of these families. in order to invite our attention to the involvement of these powerful families in the Irish literary movement. It was something that gave a lot of impetus to it. And you have a kind of, in his own way, rather, what shall you say, glorified use of that image of the houses. Now, Ramanujan uses that image of the house in order to talk about himself, his own background. The great house that you have here could be his past, his country, his religion, his tradition, his upbringing, all that, the great house. You have the image of a large sprawling house which has so many people in it. It's a typical description of an Indian joint family, many generations living together in that house. And he says, but the way in which he very ironically describes the things that happen there, or anything that goes out comes back. They find their way back to this house. It's probably a reference to the way that Indian tradition, keeps adapting. The India that we live in is actually a very heterogeneous mixture of many cultures and many traditions and so on. And that is something that is brought out by him with the use of this image of anything that goes out of this house comes back. If they find their way back, and he describes a lot of things. In each line you have some aspect of Indian culture, the kind of relationships we have within the family, outside the family, the joint family system, the relationship between one household and its neighborhood, everything. But it's almost like leafing through the pages of a book on India. Everything is presented there, but in his own very ironic, light-hearted manner. So it is not as if at the end of the poem you feel that, this great house is something that has to be celebrated. But you cannot close your eyes to the existence of that great house. It is very much there, but the way he writes about it, I invite you to read that poem when you get the time. Right now, we'll finish the other poem, Obituary. Okay, this again I think is a very significant poem of Ramanujan. Allow me to make the presentation. I have a slide with the lines of the poem. Do you have the poem with you? Yeah. So on the slide, I have just put up the image of A.K. Ramanujan, who lived from 1929 to 1993. Yeah, the poet, translator, linguist, folklorist. There's no one word that you can use to describe his contributions. Let us now see or discover Ramanujan's poetry through this poem, Obituary. Yeah, so what is an obituary? Death. It is connected with death, but in what does it refer to? Obituary. It's a kind of Maranavarta, exactly, that is it. Maranavarta. Normally you find the newspaper report reporting the death of somebody, that is an obituary. You can also refer to a tribute that is paid to somebody after that person's demise as an obituary. So this, however, is, as Shafi pointed out, the Maranavarta as printed in the newspaper. So the reference here is to the obituary that he discovers in a newspaper of his father's death. Okay, so that is the obituary. Look at how he responds to the death of the father. You would find, I mean, conventionally, you would expect the kind of sentiment to be expressed in a poem to go in this way. With father's death, everything came to a standstill in our household. Things were no longer the same, and the way in which it was a tragic event, and life being never the same again. He too says life was never the same again, but in his own different way. So what does he say? Father, when he passed on, left dust on a table of papers, left debts and daughters, a bedwetting grandson named by the toss of a coin after him, a house that leaned slowly throughout our growing years on a bent coconut tree in the yard. Being the burning type, he burned properly at the cremation as before, easily and at both ends, left his eye coins in the ashes that didn't look one bit different, several spinal discs rough, some burnt to coal for sons to pick gingerly and throw, as the priest said, facing east, where three rivers met near the railway station. Okay, we'll stop there and continue. Let's look at these images, try to visualize the images that he has incorporated in this poem. Father, when he went on, left dust on a table of papers. How does that happen? There was a table used by the father, isn't that so? And with father's demise, this is the first thing that he notices, the fact that there is a lot of dust that is gathered on the table. But more than just this image, of the table at which the father is no longer there to sit and wipe the dust away, what more does it convey? Problems. In what way? In what way? That's in the next line. No, I have not reached there. Even before that, in the very first image of the table with a lot of dust on it. Cigarette ഒക്കെ വരുന്നുണ്ട്, പക്ഷെ അതൊന്നും ഇവിടെ എത്തിയിട്ടില്ല. നിങ്ങളൊക്കെ you're thinking far ahead of. Yeah, the others here in the classroom, please contribute.
It is not used for a long time.
It was not used for a long time. Why? Very good, Amrita, but why?
Because his father was unwell, or
father was unwell. He's no more now, right? It was after his death that the table appears to be, gathering dust. Yeah. No, it conveys a very powerful image of a society that is deeply patriarchal. You have a table in the family, which is an official table, a table where you can do some reading and writing, and it is only the father who occupies that table. See, without specifying it, how well Ramanujan conveys that whole idea about the background that he comes from. He does not say we lived in a patriarchal system and so on, but these images, these are the very powerful use of images. It tells us about the role played by the father in this patriarchal system. When he is not there to sit and work at the table, it remains unused. There's no mother, the mother is probably unlettered herself and she would not be able to do anything at that table. She would, on the other hand, be busy in the great Indian kitchen. Exactly. Yeah. The table is the father's domain. That very powerful idea is conveyed. At the same time, he does not say, oh, how horrible such a system is. That's what I said. He never makes any comment, but he leaves all these images there for our perusal, for our discussion, for us to respond to it. Okay. So then what happens when he passed on? Left dust on a table of papers, left debts and daughters. That is precisely what you suggested. Yes, debts. Again, the father is the one who looked after financial matters, and we realize that the father's death reminds the son more than anything else of the debts that now have to be repaid. Again, it is not the sentimental loss of the loss of the father that the child, the person here mourns. More than that, in a very realistic manner, what strikes him is the realization of the debts. These have now got to be repaid. The reality is more is heavier than the loss. The very concrete fact of the debts that have to be repaid. That is, in Ramanujan's poetry, again, it's always the concrete, the real, the physical that takes precedence over the spiritual, the abstract, and the sentimental. Okay? So the precedence of the real over the abstract. the precedence of the physical over the spiritual. That is what you have throughout this poem, and specifically in this suggestion of the deaths. He left deaths and daughters, and look at the very clever juxtaposition of deaths and daughters. Juxtaposition is placing side by side. In one breath, he talks about, what's it? What did you miss? The real over the abstract, the physical over the spiritual. Yeah, and there is no difference between the deaths and daughters. In other words, the daughter is not a little Miss Sunshine that you would celebrate. Here, we live in a land where a daughter means heavy encumbrance. You know, in one deft line, he brings in all the references, I think, to all the suggestions to our relationship with daughters. Probably a hint of, the way that daughters always bring in associations of expenditure. The daughter has to be married off, and then she would have children, and then she would come back. She's always a drain on the family income, which is why you have so much of infanticide and hostility towards the birth of daughters, whereas it is for the birth of the son that everybody awaits. Isn't that so? Yeah. So, and Preeti ma'am has given birth to a baby girl. Have you met Preeti ma'am? She's probably taken classes for you? Yeah. She was carrying, that's why she is on leave. So this morning, last evening, she gave birth to a baby girl. So we can celebrate that. Anyway, in this poem, you have the juxtaposition of deaths and daughters, because both amount to the same. Again, he does not use concrete words in order to highlight the fact that daughters are always a drain on the family in India, but that is how he has very suggestively, that is what he has very suggestively conveyed by placing deaths and daughters together. So he left a lot of deaths and daughters. A bedwetting grandson, the grandson, again, something about the Indian tradition. When a daughter has a baby, where does she have it? She comes back to her ancestral home. That is how the daughter continues to be an encumbrance. He's suggesting how this joint family system and the Indian way of bringing the daughter back to the house. A bedwetting grandson named by the toss of a coin after him. So the grandson, again, the joint family system, the daughter probably coming back to the house to have her baby. What else? The naming of the children after their grandparents. Why was the coin tossed? Because there would have been a conflict in the family. Should he be named after the paternal grandfather or the maternal grandfather? So it was this grandfather who got the lot, when the coin was tossed, and then it was decided that this grandson would be named after him. Again, that very, what shall you say, very, very tight links that exist in the Indian joint family system. So the bedwetting grandson named by the toss of a coin after him. What else did he leave? A house that leaned slowly through our growing years on a bent coconut tree in the yard. A house that leaned slowly. In other words, a house that, began to see decline in economic terms, in financial terms, and so on. In other words, the family was probably more and more steeped in debt with the death of the father and everything else that comes along with it. The bent coconut tree, it's so evocative of the land that he belongs to. Through our growing years on a bent coconut tree in the yard. So the house that is leaning slowly is a metaphorical way of suggesting the heavy, the troubles that the family might have faced, the financial problems and so on. In other words, it is some, loss of various types that the father's death meant for them. Then something about the funeral itself. He does not talk about the grief or overpowering him at his father's funeral. He says being the burning type, he burned properly. When he was placed on the pile of, wood on which he would be cremated, he burned properly. Very, very ironic way of suggesting it. He burned properly at the cremation, being of the burning type. In reference to the very passionate life probably that the father lived. He must have enjoyed his life, a good drink, made merry and so on. So the burning type, being the burning type, he was always also probably a very passionate, maybe he would get very angry, very emotional kind of person. Probably that reference is also there. Anyway, it's in a very ironic way that the poet suggests, being the burning type, he burned properly at the cremation, as before, easily and at both ends. The other references, actually, as you rightly pointed out, to the father smoking a cigarette. At this end, he would constantly be found smoking or burning. Today, at both ends, the head and the foot. In other words, the cremation went off uneventfully. That is what is suggested by the poet. It is not as if life came to a grinding halt at the cremation. The cremation went uneventfully. He burned well, and he left his eye coins in the ashes. The eye coins, again, a reference to some of the traditions, some of the customs and rituals. There are certain communities where at the cremation you would have coins placed on the eyes when the body is burnt. It is, I do not know what the value attached to that is. Probably a kind of assurance given to the soul about security in the journey ahead or something. I really don't know what the meaning is. We have heard of the Egyptian mummies, right? In the pyramids, you find the mummies who were buried with everything, all the things that they would need, all those things that they would have used as human beings in their life here would be provided for their life henceforth as well in the pyramid. In a similar manner, probably to provide some kind of financial assurance or something, this was a custom. These people are more bothered about the coins there. The coins are intact there, like the gold bangle left by the ancestor who passed away and which the daughter was in search of. He left his eye coins in the ashes. That didn't look one bit different. Yeah, that is a very significant fact. When he looks at the ash that is left by the father, you realize that from dust we come and to dust we go back. It is not as if this ash was in any way different. We consider this ash to be very holy because the ashes would be smattered in the rivers and so on. We've heard of great leaders whose ashes are spread or scattered in the rivers, mountains, and so on. But this is ash that is no different from the ash that is left when we do our cooking at home, when we burn firewood at home. It's just like that. The ashes did not look one bit different. And in the ashes, again, a kind of, it's not trivialization, but a kind of deliberate attempt not to sentimentalize or glorify these things in an undue manner. There is no need to go overboard sentimentalizing these and attaching too much of a glorificatory attitude towards these. There's no need for that. He says the ashes were just like ordinary ash, and in that you could find the spinal discs, the bones left after burning, rough, some burnt to gold. Some of the burns had been burnt properly, some were rough. And what are the burns for? Again, the bones for, again, the reference to the Indian custom of, the Astiyurka, that ceremony. The bones are picked up by the sons to pick gingerly, as the sons would pick up the bones from the ashes. And these are the ones that are, let flow in the river or the sea after, again, a lot of rituals. What is the belief? That the soul would reach heaven if the sons perform the ceremony, the rituals after death. The sons pick them gingerly and throw, as the priest said, obeying the priest, not because they were, again, the very important role played by the priest in all these affairs. That is also suggested that you get a lot of suggestions. You get all these images there. It's almost like looking at a painting where you have an Indian, the great Indian family or the great Indian customs depicted there. So you find the priest there chanting the mantras, and then the sons throw the bones into the water, flowing water, facing east. Where do they do it? At a very holy spot. Which is a holy spot? The three rivers meeting. It is a sangam. It is a kind of triveni, which it's a very holy spot, like the kind that you have in Allahabad, for example, where the Ganga, Yamuna, and the Saraswati, they meet, and it's a sangam. It's a very holy spot. But the moment he highlights that holiness, look at the very next image there, which actually, it's like a zeugma kind of figure of speech, where from something that is supposed to be very lofty and solemn and all that, you come down to a very pathetic level. What does he say? Near the railway station. That is the location of the river. Normally you would say the railway station is near the Sangam, because the Sangam or the Triveni would be the most important location. But now more important things have come along. India has changed. The land to which I belong has changed so much. And the railway station, where is the Sangam? It is near the railway station. The railway station has probably acquired more importance than the Sangam itself. Okay, so near the railway station, like a kind of deliberate anti-glorification here, rather than, it's not trivialization, but at the same time conveying the reality with near the railway station. No long-standing headstone with his full name and 2 dates. The tombstone which would be placed on the place, at the place where he would be buried, the cremation would have taken place. We did not have any of those things. We could not afford to, probably. There was no long-standing tombstone with an epitaph written on it, or the dates or anything to hold in their parentheses. Everything he didn't quite manage to do himself. They did not believe that there was a need for this kind of a headstone to be erected, like his Caesarean birth in a Brahmin ghetto and his death by heart failure in the fruit market, from the beginning till the end. So the Brahmin background, the death by heart failure in a fruit market. Again, presenting the death in a very realistic manner. He does not say that the death came on a day that the whole world came to a standstill. Nothing like that. He died like any other human being in a market, in a fruit market. He died due to a heart failure. So it was a long life, and we didn't think that all the experiences of that life could be enclosed within the brackets, the parentheses on a headstone. In other words, it was just an ordinary life. It is not as if he was a king or a ruler where you have something great to proclaim in the epitaph or on the tombstone. This long life with its ordinary events is too long to be compressed into a brief note held within brackets in a tombstone, which is why they didn't do that. But someone told me he got 2 lines in an inside column of a Madras newspaper. So that is the obituary that is being referred to. He himself was not probably aware of that obituary. One of his friends or someone told him about 2 lines in an inside column in the Madras newspaper. And how did that person discover it? When it was brought back from the grocery with something used as a wrapping for something, sold by the kilo exactly 4 weeks later to street hawkers who sell it in turns to the small groceries, where I buy salt, coriander, and jaggery in newspaper cones that I usually read. So look at the more important things. We do not have time to again frame the obituary and keep it for as a keepsake. It was sold along with other newspapers the next day, and it comes back in the form of a grocery cone, wrapping maybe salt or coriander or jaggery, and in newspaper cones that I usually read. For what? For fun. Not because of any other reason, but for fun. And lately, in the hope of finding these obituary lines. Ever since someone told him about the obituary of his father that somebody came across in a newspaper that came back from the grocery store, these days, he too takes some interest in these obituary lines. And he left us. And final blow comes when he says, and he left us a changed mother. Why is the mother changed? She has, of course, now become a widow. She would probably start wearing white. And in some traditions, they would also shave off their hair. In that way, physically changed. And more than one annual ritual. Ultimately, that is what the death of the father means. We now have one more annual ritual to conduct. And a ritual, again, means expenditure. More than anything else, it means expenditure. It is in that sense that he comes, concludes the line, he left us a changed mother and more than one annual ritual. So this is a typical Ramanujan poem, I would say, which in a very ironically objective manner talks about the death of the father and what it means to continue to live in the family without the father. It just means that the things that his father did are no longer done, but others have to take care of the responsibilities like getting the daughters married, looking after the grandson, the grandchildren who would be born in the house, and then performing the annual ritual, which is something that cannot be avoided. Ultimately, it comes down to that. So I think it's a poem that encapsulates in it the best of Ramanujan's, the features of Ramanujan's poetry. Are you able to appreciate it? In the class also, you can speak in the classroom. Any responses to the poem? Okay, shall I stop now?